Voordat ek begin, ek ietsie sê, in die eerste plek, jy sal sien die titel is the Sistine Chapel Ceiling, Dei Ficatio Made Visible. Nou, wil ek net gou verduidelik wat daardie Dei Ficatio beteken. En dit was 'n geloof in die tyd van Michelangelo, dat hy wou wys dat die mens, dat God dit moontlik gemaak het vir die mens om weer na hom toe terug te keer soos wat hulle in die paradys by hom was. Met ander woorde, Dei Ficatio beteken om terug te keer na God. Return to God. En jy sal later sien in die uitleg van die kapel, maak hy dit visueel. Hy maak dit vir ons visueel, hoe die mens terugkeer na God toe. And then I want to also mention ek is gevra om die presentation in Engels te doen, maar julle is vry om vir my vrae in Afrikaans te vra. Michelangelo was 33 years old when he started this fresco on the ceiling of this chapel. I'm not going to deal with the large big painting on the western wall which shows the Last Judgment, but that he did 43 years later. When he was 76 years old, he started with that painting, and that magnificent work is the work of an old man of 76 years. So it's just to put you in sort of the whole thing in perspective. Now, the Sistine Chapel has generally been considered to be one of the most famous painted interior spaces in the world. And virtually all of this fame comes from Michelangelo Buonarroti's breathtaking painting, which he painted between 1508 and 1512 on the ceiling. Apologies for the visuals that are not so clear, but on the left there you have a portrait of Michelangelo, and then a picture of the interior of the Sistine Chapel ceiling. I don't know how many of you have been there recently. Of course, it was cleaned a number of years ago, and today if you go there, you are not allowed to stand still on the floor and look at it. You must move. The guards over there are continually telling you to move around, move, don't stand still. I'm not very sure what the reason is. It's probably for the breath that reacts with the fresco. On the 23rd of August, 1787, when the great German poet and writer Johann Wolfgang Goethe was asked about the Sistine Chapel ceiling, he remarked that without having seen it, one cannot form an appreciable idea of what one man is capable of achieving. Earlier, the Italian biographer Giorgio Vasari had noted that when the vault was revealed for the first time, the whole world came running, and that the sight of it was enough to reduce them to a stunned silence. Today, it still reduces the visitor to a stunned silence, and you notice that when you go into the chapel. The Sistine Chapel was built in 1479 under the direction of Pope Sixtus IV, who gave it his name. That's why it's called the Sistine Chapel. It's named after Pope Sixtus IV. On 15 August 1483, his nephew, Pope Julius II, dedicated the chapel to the Assumption of the Virgin. So the whole chapel is actually dedicated to the Assumption of the Virgin. It is very close to St. Peter's Basilica and the Belvedere courtyard in the Vatican, and it's quite a large space. This chapel inside measures 40.9 meters long, 14 meters wide, and with a vaulted ceiling rising 13.4 meters above the main floor. There you can see the building from outside, and you can see the windows all around, but 13 meters is quite a high building. The vault is of quite a complex design and not the ideal canvas for a painting. And I want to show you, I have this schematic view just to show you the problems that he was confronted with, because it wasn't a flat surface. You see that there are vertical areas. If you look at, for instance, right on the left, those green curved, those are curved planes, curved surfaces. The round arched ones at the bottom, they are vertical surfaces. The blue areas in the middle are horizontal surfaces. And then you have the white areas in the middle. There are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 little blocks you can see over there. Those are actually sloping surfaces. So he was forced to work on various surfaces. And you must remember that it's fresco, it's wet cement that he had to put on these surfaces. They roughened the wall, and then the wet cement was put on the surface, and then they just put enough plaster on the wall so that he could work for a day. And they called that the giornata, or giornato, 1 day's work. And of course, it was 3 years that he worked over there, so it's quite a thing. Originally, the vaulted ceiling was painted blue and covered with golden stars by Pier Matteo de Amelia. And you can see the stars on the ceiling in the middle there. And interesting is that in an earlier time, I hope my marker, you see there they look like statues next to the windows. On each side of the window there's a painting of a pope. Those are the paintings of the popes, and then the story of Jesus and also of Moses is told in large paintings that run along the side over here. Here, for instance, is Periginu's story of the marriage of the Virgin. But of course, when Michelangelo painted his Last Judgment on the wall at the back over there, those windows were closed and all those paintings and things there were destroyed. The walls were decorated with frescoes by different earlier Renaissance artists such as Botticelli, Ghirlandaio, Perugino, Pinturicchio, Signorelli, and Rosselli, representing the histories of Moses and Christ. Now, in order to understand the painting of the Sistine Chapel ceiling in context, one must consider Michelangelo's earlier dealings with Pope Julius II. He was a warrior pope who undertook an aggressive campaign to unite and empower Italy under the leadership of the Church, and thereby cement papal power. This wasn't an ordinary pope. He was a soldier. He was a warrior. He took part in numerous battles. And since Michelangelo was primarily a sculptor and not a painter, his first grand commission for Pope Julius II in 1503 was a massive sculptural tomb for the new St. Peter's Basilica, which at that time was being rebuilt for this Pope by the architect Donato Bramante. As originally conceived, Michelangelo's tomb for the Pope was to have been a colossal, freestanding, three-level mausoleum. And you can see there's an attempted reconstruction of that tomb. Now you can imagine how enormous it is that those figures that you see around there are all larger than life size. And only a few have survived, well, only a few were finished. The one on the corner is supposed to be Moses, which I'll show you just now, which has been finished, or which was finished. But there have been various attempts to sort of explain how this tomb actually looked. The one on the right over there is Erwin Panofsky's idea of what the tomb could have looked like. What's very interesting about this tomb is that it's actually conceived in three levels. And as you can see, I mentioned them there. You have the lower material zone, which has sculptures of victories and slaves. And then you have the central zone, which is actually the world of the souls. These were the people that had contact with God, like Moses and St. Paul. And then he brings in two personified figures, the active life and the contemplative life. And then at the top you have the vision with God, actually God's representative on earth. That's the Pope. The Pope is the representative of God, and the angels are those who are always in service of God. And already in 1505, Michelangelo spent 8 months at Carrara choosing the marble for this project. Initially, Michelangelo visualized his tomb monument not in 2 dimensions as it is today. What we see today is just a wall, but extending in depth to hold 40 life-size statues. It was to be a freestanding mausoleum, 10.8 meters long, 7.2 meters wide, and rising in 3 zones, tapering off into a pyramid at the top. In the early design of 1503, Michelangelo developed and perfected his idea and intentions for this tomb. We see that in pyramidal form, he laid out the 3 realms experienced and traversed by the human soul. There was a lower material zone ruled by destiny, symbolizing the sphere of conflicting forces and bondage, and occupying a wide area. This level indicated a world of tribulation and perpetual judgment, which in short is our earthly level, the world we live in. This was the level of the human body, and that's why he placed so much emphasis on the human body over there. Here he visualized niches with muscular statues of victories and slaves. The central zone, the one above it, was the more limited world of the soul, showing a realm of the inwardly liberated soul, where contemplation has replaced dependence and bondage to nature. The thinking of the Renaissance comes out here clearly. They thought that by contemplating and by reasoning, you move closer to God. And that is shown over there. Here Michelangelo visualized 4 seated figures representing Moses and Paul, the active life and the contemplative life, on the front and back of the tomb. The uppermost level was the heavenly realm, which was the sphere of glory in which God is ever present. This was the level of the human spirit. Here Michelangelo visualized 2 allegorical figures of angels supporting a sarcophagus with the figure of Pope Julius as God's representative on earth. So now you're going to ask me, why am I dealing with this tomb in so much detail? But you will see presently why. Now, he didn't finish this tomb, and what we have are a number of figures, some of them in the Academia in Florence, and some of them in the Louvre in Paris. And you can see these figures that emphasize the human body. They emphasize the human body, so they're on that lower level. And then, of course, his most famous, or one of his most famous sculptures is the Moses over there, that was made for the second level. They say, of course, that when he finished it, he tapped the Moses with his hammer on the knee and said, "Rise and speak." It's a magnificent sculpture, and it doesn't really come to its right where it is now in the chapel of the in chains on the Campidoglio in Rome. But interesting also, there are some of Michelangelo's preliminary sketches for this tomb of Pope Julius II. Sadly, the project became one of the great disappointments of Michelangelo's life, when Pope Julius II, for seemingly unexplained reasons, cancelled the commission. According to Vasari, it was Michelangelo's rivals in Rome, Bramante and his uncle, Raphael and his uncle Bramante, who, in their jealousy of Michelangelo, convinced the Pope that it was bad luck to have his tomb built before his own lifetime. Further, they deceitfully convinced the Pope that Michelangelo's time would be better spent on the painting of the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel in the Vatican Palace, because they hoped that he would fail as a painter and leave Rome in disgrace. In other words, leave Rome to them as the great painters of that time. So early in 1506, Pope Julius II conceived the plan to have the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel painted by Michelangelo. Michelangelo, however, was reluctant to take on the work and refused. But the powerful Pope was adamant, leaving him no choice but to accept. He set to work at once, producing the 200 to 300 preliminary drawings that had to be made before the large cartoons could be started. And we have some of the drawings there in the Windsor collection in London. There you can see a rough sketch of a layout that he has on the left over there, and here are some sketches of hands that he made for this ceiling. Of course, the majority of the drawings have disappeared, unfortunately. Already on the 10th of May 1506, Michelangelo received payment for drawings and cartoons from the Pope. It was only 2 years later, on the 10th of May 1508, that the Pope signed a contract with Michelangelo to have the pendentives in the chapel filled by 12 large painted figures of the apostles. This is what the Pope wanted. 12 large figures of the apostles in those corner pendentives that you see in the chapel. Michelangelo, however, convinced the Pope that his scheme would be poor, or as he said, povero, because the apostles were poor. And he negotiated for a more complex scheme, and the Pope finally permitted him to do as he liked. The fact that the Pope gave Michelangelo the fullest liberty with respect to choosing the subject is of great importance in the history of the relationship between artist and client. It was never so before. It marks an important step forward in the process of liberating the artist and raising the visual arts to the level of the liberal arts. Like music and literature, art becomes a liberal art, and it elevates the status of the artist. And very few countries had this in this time. Italy was one, and the Netherlands was another. But in Spain it wasn't allowed. An artist was just a manual laborer. He was a craftsman. From the earliest drawings of this layout for the ceiling, one immediately notices that the basic scheme is the same as for the planned tomb of Pope Julius II. What does he do? He paints the three zones that he was going to sculpt. In the middle, you have the heavenly sphere, and then the white on the sides is the sphere of the souls, and then around the edges, the earthly sphere. So the idea that he had, that was actually broken down by the Pope, is revived in this painting. There were also three levels rising in spiritual significance. Michelangelo started off by using a trompe-l'oeil architectural structure in his design to introduce order and clarity. In other words, a very realistic architectural structure that he puts in there, and in between he paints the scenes that are important. He did not see himself as a painter and approached his new task as a sculptor. In the context of the entire ceiling, all the figures must consequently be understood as simulated sculpture. Now that the ceiling has been cleaned, we notice that all the colors allude to the tones of marble, bronze, and other metals. Even the little figures, the putti characters of the thrones, which in their capacity as chair ornaments can also be seen as figurative sculpture. Look at that. They really look like sculptures, not like paintings. On the 11th of May 1506, before commencing with the painting of the fresco, Michelangelo erected a self-designed scaffold to reach the chapel's ceiling, after rejecting scaffolding made by Bramante. And there is a reconstruction of the scaffolding. So you must know it must reach almost 13 and a half meters above the ground level, so that he could stand there and paint. And you see that in this reconstruction or drawing, reconstructing the scene, you see the Pope climbing up the ladder to reach Michelangelo at the top. Rather than building it up from the floor, he constructed a flat wooden platform on brackets built out from holes in the wall near the top of the windows to cut the cost of timber. From the outset, he put the brackets and the frame that supported the steps and floor in place and suspended a lightweight cloth screen beneath them to catch plaster drips, dust, and splashes of paint. From reports by students, we know that only half the building was scaffolded at a time, and the platform was moved as the painting was done in stages. The areas of the wall which were covered by the scaffolding still appear as unpainted areas across the bottom of the lunettes And you can see it clearly down there. Can you see there? There's no paint on that area there. That's where the scaffolding stood. Michelangelo painted in a standing position. I have this nice reconstruction of him standing over there with all his helpers around him. Everybody had things to do. They mixed paint, and they, you can see in the background there's somebody tracing a drawing onto the wall, and Michelangelo's doing the painting over there. He painted in a standing position, not lying on his back as is often believed. But he nevertheless painted under extremely uncomfortable conditions because he had to work with his head tilted upwards. And he actually wrote a poem on the right-hand side of it. You can see there's a drawing of himself standing and painting over there. I don't know if it's the saint that he's painting, but it looks like the hair and the eyes. And he's standing with his head back and he's painting, and next to this little drawing he wrote a poem about the work that he did there and the agony and the ecstasy that took place over there. A major problem in the beginning was that Michelangelo had to contend with mold growing on the wet plaster, or the so-called intonaco, and he was forced to scrape off his first version of the Great Flood and redo it. Here you can see these are the very first sections that he painted. A, in the middle over there, the story of Noah. B, which you can see on the corners of the main scenes are the nude figures, the nude male figures, the nudity, they are painted. And then the prophets and the sibyls that you see on the edges, C and D. But this is the first section that he painted, and of course, after he painted this section, he had to take down the scaffolding, and then for the first time he could see what the thing looked like from the floor. He eventually solved this problem by adopting a new fresco formula. We also know that Michelangelo often repainted areas he was not satisfied with, and that he read and reread the Old Testament while he was painting. Frederick Hart mentions that he reread the Old Testament 20 times, drawing his inspiration from Scripture rather than from the established traditions of biblical painting. Instead of making the customary full-size detailed drawings or cartoons to transfer his design onto the wet plaster surface, Michelangelo broke with convention by drawing directly on the ceiling. Now, you can think how difficult that must have been to get the proportions correct if you can't see from a distance. He couldn't go down onto the floor and look how it looks from the bottom. So he worked directly on the ceiling. On some of the surfaces, we can clearly see his energetic sweeping outlines, while on others a grid is evident, indicating that he enlarged directly onto the ceiling from a small drawing. So he made little blocks, and then he drew the part in between there. In his painting of the Sistine, Michelangelo employed all the finest workshop methods and techniques of the time, representing a diversity of brushwork and a breadth of his skill as a fresco painter. He wasn't really a fresco painter, but he learned very quickly. And some of the pieces that he produced are just magnificent. The one on the right is very early. the one on the left is the very famous hands of Adam and God, the fingers of Adam and God, and which is painted slightly later. But you can see the outline drawings and how he filled in. He mostly used a wash technique to apply broad areas of color, and then as the surface became drier, he revisited them with a more linear approach, adding shade and detail with a variety of brushes. For the textured surfaces, he generally used a broad brush with coarse bristles, and you can see it in the hair. Unfortunately, it's not clear enough on that image on the right over there, but you can see it in the hair. He uses this very broad brush. Michelangelo started the massive fresco at the end of the building, furthest from the altar, and progressed step by step towards the altar. So he's working from the entrance door to the altar. In order to see the scenes right side up, one must stand at the eastern entrance to the chapel. In other words, he forces you to go to the entrance to look at all these paintings. Where Michelangelo started, but then they have to be read backwards in time, from the story of Noah overhead to the creation above the altar at the end. Very interesting. So the chronology is wrong from where you stand. In other words, you move from the story of Noah to God creating the world. And this is part of the De Fecatio which I told you about in the beginning. And there, of course, is the whole 343 figures. Although the overt subject matter of the ceiling is the doctrine of humanity's need for salvation as offered by God through Jesus Christ, Michelangelo used it to illustrate his idea of the three levels of man's divine heritage and his interaction with God. He was given the task of representing man's salvation, but he combines it with that idea that he had in the tomb of Julius II, the idea of man's the three levels of man's divine heritage and also his interaction with God. It is a projection on the wall surface of the principal motives contained in his project of the tomb of Julius II. Michelangelo was well versed in Renaissance thinking that sought to reconcile Christian theology with the philosophy of the Renaissance humanism. The humanist vision of humanity was one in which people responded to other people, to social responsibility, and to God in a direct way, not through the church as an intermediary. Ideal beauty was equated with godliness, according to humanism, while the Roman Catholic Church emphasized humanity as essentially sinful and flawed. Renaissance humanism emphasized humanity as potentially noble and beautiful. That contrast that you have between the humanist's view of man and the church's view. These two views were not necessarily irreconcilable to the church, but only through a recognition that the unique way to achieve this elevation of spirit, mind, and body was through the church as the agent of God. So the church wanted a say in this also. Michelangelo, as a devout and practicing Catholic, illustrated his faith by using mythology, philosophy, and the Old Testament to create a vision that was utterly his own. The 343 figures, and they're larger than life size, in the ceiling took Michelangelo 4 years to complete. which means roughly one figure every 4 days. When we looked up at the ceiling, at the Sistine Chapel ceiling, we noticed that everything centers around the human being, emphasizing the Renaissance view of man as the measure of all things. It seems highly probable that behind all this was the new Platonic idea that God's image is reflected in man in different degrees. So it was a way to connect humanism with the ideology of the church of that time. But how do we explain the overall subject of this ceiling, and what does it express and symbolize? That is the big question. The theological concept governing the basis of the work consisted of the faithful story of man from his original innocence to his sin and punishment, from there to his reconciliation with God, and then once more to sin, awaiting final redemption from the hands of Jesus Christ. So it was the story of the fall from paradise, and then the fall in the time of Noah, and eventually the saving by Jesus Christ. In many respects, the overall composition reflects the abandoned plans of the fatal tomb. Michelangelo fitted the narrative elements of the ceiling into his 3-layered layout, rising above the spectator on the ground. The basic idea of the whole composition represents the 3 levels of creation in man fashioned by God, namely his body, his soul, and his spirit. The 3 things that God put in man: body, soul, spirit. And that's what we see in this whole composition. To give a full interpretation of the whole Sistine Chapel ceiling in the limited time I have may easily become too complex. I therefore deemed it best to first consider the spiritual zone with the mosaic story of creation, that is that central section of 9 panels, and then the zone of the souls with its enthroned figures, the second layer around that. The themes added at the end to the spandrels and lunettes representing the earthly zone. These are these little triangles around the edges, are very complex and consequently call for less close analysis. So I thought I'd leave that, and I'm just going to concentrate on the central, the zone of the souls and the zone of the spirits. Now, in the spiritual zone, along the central section of the ceiling, Michelangelo depicted 9 scenes from the book of Genesis. And there you have them, the 9 scenes. If you start at the bottom here, you run through those, and then it continues on the right over there. In other words, it starts over there, and then it runs that way, and it runs there to that scene from the life of Noah. I'm going to discuss them in more detail. That's why I don't want to waste too much time here, but you can see this is called the spiritual zone. This was that highest part of the tomb. Man with God. In other words, man with God. The pictures are organized in 3 groups of 3, alternating large and small panels. The uppermost central zone that skirts the parting of the vault shows the sphere of divine self-begetting and creation, including God and man, and the mystery of the fall which led to the great flood and Noah's degradation, but also to his offering as a sign of redemption and reunion with God. It visually illustrates how God made the world as a perfect creation and put humanity into it. That humanity fell in disgrace and was punished by death and by separation from God. Humanity then sank further into sin and disgrace and was punished by being almost entirely wiped out by the great flood. This transcendental zone is rendered remote by skillful use of perspective, while the awakened ones, the seers and the prophetesses of the middle zone, are intensely present and alive. Those figures that you see around these, it almost looks as though the tonality of the central panel is lighter than the next level. So he really shows the difference between the zone of the spirits and the zone of the souls. The three sections of creation, downfall, and fate of humanity appear in reverse order when read from the entrance of the chapel. The first group of three pictures from the entrance shows the plight of humanity, and in particularly the family of Noah. There you see the three. A small one, which deals with the life of Noah soon after or just before the flood, and then you have a bigger one which deals with the flood, and then you have a smaller one which deals with Noah's sacrifice after the flood. The second group shows God creating the first man and woman, Adam and Eve, and their disobedience of God and consequent expulsion from the Garden of Eden, where they had lived and where they walked with God. The third group shows God creating the heavens and the earth. With a reversed progression of the scenes, Michelangelo wanted to symbolize a return to a state of grace and emphasize the process of deificatio, which I mentioned, to show a return from physical to spiritual being. When studying these scenes, it becomes obvious that as the representations move towards the altar side of the chapel, the figures become more spiritual, larger, and more expressive of movement. So the images also conform to the idea of getting nearer and nearer to God. So, and this is what's amazing about this chapel, is that when you enter the chapel as a sinful man, and when you move closer to the altar to receive the Eucharist and to meet God, you become more spiritual. So you have this unbelievable thing that Michelangelo does in this chapel. The first three scenes from the story of Noah, as one enters the chapel, contain a much larger number of small figures than the later panels. This is partly because of the subject matter, which deals with the fate of humanity, but also because all the figures at the end of the ceiling, including the prophets and the nudes, are smaller than in the central section. After the first section of the ceiling was completed in September 1509, the scaffolding was taken down, and Michelangelo had his first chance to see how the work looked from the floor. The second section, which must have been painted from a new scaffolding, expands still further Michelangelo's newly discovered scale, which started with the fall of man's scenes, which we'll look at just now. As the scale got larger, Michelangelo's style became broader, and consequently the final narrative scene of God in the act of creation was painted in a single day. The first fresco from the story of Noah that meets the eye as one enters the chapel through the east door is Noah's drunkenness. You see old Noah in his drunkenness lying over there and his sons around him. But you also see Noah tilling the ground in the background over there. After the flood, Noah tilled the soil and grew vines, as we see him doing in the background of the picture. He became drunk and inadvertently exposed himself. Of course, he planted the vines and harvested the grapes, and then he produced the wine, which made him drunk. And you see the big barrel of wine standing behind him over there. His youngest son, Ham, brought his two brothers, Shem and Jephthah, to see the sight. But they discreetly covered their father with a cloak, and then you can see them doing it there. Ham was later cursed by Noah and told that the descendants of Ham's son Canaan would serve Shem and Jephthah's descendants forever. Although also naked, the sons were not scandalized by their father's nakedness, but by his drunkenness. So it doesn't concern the nakedness of the father or the nakedness of the sons, but the fact that Noah was drunk, which according to Neoplatonism, the philosophy of the humanists, can be interpreted as a symbol of the imprisonment of the soul in the body. Drunkenness is an imprisonment of the soul in the body. The next fresco, much larger than the former, represents the Great Flood, and was the first fresco that Michelangelo painted on the ceiling. The lack of coherence in the detail of the scene bears evidence to Michelangelo's immaturity with fresco painting, as the pictorial space is much more sculptural than painterly. From Michelangelo, it was not the event itself, or for Michelangelo, it was not the event itself which was decisive, but its effect on the people experiencing it. We see the ark in which Noah's family escaped floating at the rear of the picture. There, it looks like a house. While the rest of humanity tries frantically to scramble to some point of safety. In this scene, Michelangelo hardly indicated the destructive forces of nature causing the flood. This picture, which has a large number of figures, conforms the most closely to the format of the earlier Quattrocento paintings that existed around the walls when Michelangelo started painting in the chapel. So like any artist, he must have looked at the paintings that were on the walls around him and he tried to emulate them in this painting. The third scene in this group was Noah's offering, which depicted the sacrifice made by Noah and his family after their safe deliverance from the great flood, which destroyed the rest of humankind. The special composition in which all the figures are arranged in an oval. Look at the nice oval, the figures at the top and the arms form right in the middle. And Noah is right in the middle of that oval. Is kept rigorously in perspective and is clarified by the angle at which the altar is turned. Taken together, these three pictures serve to show that humankind had moved a long way from God's perfect creation. It was only after having painted these three episodes that Michelangelo proceeded with the three prophets, the two Sibyls, and the 8 nude figures of this section of the painting. And you can see the prophets and the Sibyls on the edges over there, and then you can count the nude figures there. You will see 1, 2, 3, 4, and that one has disappeared. It doesn't exist anymore. 5, 6, 7, and then of course the one that has disappeared is the 8th. And then you have alternating Sibyl and a prophet, a Sibyl and a prophet. In the central section of the spiritual zone of the ceiling, Michelangelo has taken 4 episodes from the story of Adam and Eve, as told in the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd chapters of Genesis. These 3 panels that you see in the middle over there. In this sequence of 3, 2 of the panels are large and 1 small. Different to the earlier ones where you had 2 small and 1 large. Here you have 2 large and 1 small. In the first large panel from this group, from the entrance, Michelangelo combined 2 contrasting scenes into one panel, showing the fall of man. In the left half of the scene, we see how Eve trustingly takes the forbidden fruit from the hand of the serpent, and how Adam eagerly picks it for himself. And in the right half of the scene, we see how they are banished from the Garden of Eden, where they had lived in the company of God, to a world outside where they have to fend for themselves and experience death. In a single overarching shape, formed by the outstretched arm of the tempting Satan. Can you see that arch that runs over the top over there? And the avenging angel, the crime of disobedience of the first 2 humans leads to its punishment by banishment from the garden. The central scene of this group shows the smaller panel of the creation of Eve. In this fresco, God creates Eve from the side of the sleeping Adam, and for the first time, God is represented as a figure standing on earth at the right. In the next section, all of which can be dated within the year 1511, form and spirit change beyond recognition. For the first time, Michelangelo's figures fill the entire foreground space and are scaled to harmonize with the surrounding nude figures. In this 3rd picture of this group, and one of the most widely recognized images in the history of painting, Michelangelo represented the creation of Adam. Of all the images on the ceiling, the creation of Adam is the one that has most deeply impressed posterity. God reaches out to touch Adam and infuse in him the spark of life. Eve looks out a little apprehensively from beneath the sheltering arm of God. We see her over there. In the breadth and nobility of the proportions, in the pulsation of the forms, and in the flow of their contours, above all in the intensity of feeling that moves through every plane, Adam is one of the most beautiful human figures ever imagined. The 3 creation pictures nearest to the altar show scenes from the 1st chapter of Genesis, which relates that God created the earth and all that is in it in 6 days, resting on the 7th day. In the 3rd smaller scene from the altar, representing God separating earth and water, we see him as a powerful old man. It's on over there, stretching out his 2 hands to set the cosmos in order by separating the earth and the waters. Look how powerful this image has become. There's nothing that draws the attention away from the central image. In the others, we have many other figures. Here, it's only the figure of God with the angels around him. The final large scene depicts two incidents in one. This one. The creation of sun, moon, and plants. In a simple cruciform gesture, God sweeping through the heavens, attended by 4 angels, points to the sun and moon, causing them to spring into being. At the left, Michelangelo shows the Lord from the back, stretching forth his hand on a 3rd day to call plant life from the earth. And you see the plants in the corner at the bottom there. In the last scene, from the spiritual zone directly over the altar, known as the separation of light from darkness, God creates light and separates light from darkness. With his arms raised like a priest, the Lord shows his plan for human salvation as pre-existent from the moment in which he separated the light from the darkness. If he divides the light from the darkness, it is the creation and manifestation of himself as light. Here, Michelangelo's anthropomorphous whirlwind figure in cosmic labor pain is an awe-inspiring sight. And even if you look at the face here, unfortunately it's not so clear here, but you see his throat and the chin. It doesn't look like a human being. The 3 scenes completed in the 3rd stage of painting are the most broadly conceived and most broadly painted and the most dynamic of all the pictures. Between the upper spiritual layer and the sphere of souls, Michelangelo placed 20 nude male figures as supporting figures at each corner of the 5 smaller narrative scenes that ran along the center of the ceiling. And I think here we have some of the most magnificent portrayals of human figures you can think of. I'm just going to show you a few of them. Very interesting also is that you see the acorns over here, and they often appear with these nude figures. Those acorns are actually the symbols of the Medici family, and also of the family, of the Medici family at that time. And there are more. They have been seen as angels and are the ever-present attendants and messengers of God, impassively watching and waiting for the fate of humankind. The triumph of beauty embodied in these stupendous inudi is undoubtedly connected in some way with the Neoplatonic conception of divine beauty. Their painting demonstrates more than any other figures on the ceiling Michelangelo's mastery of anatomy and foreshortening and his enormous powers of invention. Above the earthly sphere and closer to the center extends the sphere of the souls. Here we have the illustrious assembly of the prophets of Israel and the sibyls of the classical world. These are the people that have had contact with God in some other way. They are endowed with a spiritual power which makes them divine instruments, contemplating the divine and having inspired knowledge of what is decreed for ordinary unaware humanity. They are the awakened ones or beings. They have had direct contact with God. They are not with God continually, but they've had contact with God and could thereby prophesy the coming of the Savior. On the 5 pendentives along each side and the 2 on either end, Michelangelo painted the largest figures on the ceiling. 12 people who prophesied, and represented some aspect of the coming of Christ. Of those 12, 7 are prophets of Israel and were male. The remaining 5 were prophets of the classical world. Again, the Renaissance idea of the combination between the classical world and the Christian world, called the Sibyls, and they are all female. The 7 prophets of Israel chosen for depiction on the ceiling include the 4 so-called major prophets. Isaiah, there you see Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and of course Daniel at the bottom there. Of the remaining possibilities among the 12 minor prophets, the 3 represented are Joel, which you see on the right of here. You want me to go slowly so that you can look in more detail at these magnificent figures. They are absolutely phenomenal. And now, after they were cleaned, I will show you just now what they looked like previously and after they were cleaned. Joel, and then of course Zechariah and Jonah. Although the prophets Joel and Zechariah are considered minor because of the comparatively small number of pages that their prophecy occupies in the Bible, each one produced prophecies of profound significance. I mean, if you take Jonah, Jonah is a forerunner of Christ. He goes into the belly of the fish for 3 days and then is spat out alive. Christ goes into the grave for 3 days and rises from the dead. Joel, for his prophecy that, and I quote him, "Your sons and your daughters shall prophesy, your elderly shall dream dreams, and your youth shall see visions." These words were significant for Michelangelo's decorative scheme, where women take their place among men, and the youthful Daniel sits across from the brooding Jeremiah with his long white beard. Zechariah's significant prophecy stated, and I quote him, "Behold, your king comes to you, humble and riding on a donkey." Michelangelo placed him in the chapel directly above the door through which the Pope was carried in procession on Palm Sunday, the day on which Jesus fulfilled the prophecy by riding into Jerusalem on a donkey and being proclaimed king. Interesting how Michelangelo connects this with the idea of Palm Sunday and with what happens in reality in the chapel. On Palm Sunday, the Pope is carried in with palm leaves and above him is the prophet that made that prophecy. Jonah, who spent 3 days in the belly of a fish before he was eventually spewed up on dry land, was seen as a precursor of Christ, who, having died by crucifixion, spent part of 3 days in a tomb and was raised on the 3rd day. So on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, Jonah, with the great fish beside him, can you see the fish there? And his eyes turned towards God, the Creator, represents a portent of the passion and the resurrection of Christ. And you know what's amazing? That Jonah is placed directly beneath the latest scene of the Last Judgment that Michelangelo represented. So Jonah is looking up at Christ. And 43 years before, he painted that Last Judgment. Already he had painted Jonah looking up at the Christ. The Sibyls, and these are so beautiful, were prophetic women who were resident at shrines or temples throughout the classical world. The symbols selected and represented were the Delphic symbol, which you see over there, the Libyan symbol, and it's interesting to see from which parts of the world they come. From Greece, North Africa, the Erythrean symbol from Eritrea, the Cumaean symbol, and the Persian symbol. These 5 particular symbols were most probably selected by Michelangelo for a wide geographic coverage, with the symbols coming from Africa, Asia, Greece, and Ionia. The 5 depicted here are each said to have prophesied the birth of Christ. The Cumaean symbol, for example, is quoted by Virgil in his 4th Eclogue as declaring that, and I quote her, the symbol in the middle over there, a new progeny of heaven would bring about a return of the golden age. This was interpreted as referring to Jesus. Now, between the large pendentives that support the vault are windows, 6 on each side of the chapel, as I showed you in the beginning. Above each window is an arch shape referred to as a lunette, and above 8 of the lunettes at the sides of the chapel are triangular spandrels, filling the spaces between the side pendentives and the vault. The other 8 lunettes, each being below one of the corner pendentives. Here you can see the scenes below those lunettes. The structures form visual bridges between the walls and the ceiling, and the figures which are painted on them are midway in size, approximately 2 meters high. Between the very large prophets and the much smaller figures of the popes, which had been painted to either side of each window in the 15th century. So they're very 100 years before Michelangelo. In order to express all 3 levels of man's divine inheritance in terms of human forms, Michelangelo placed in the spandrels and lunettes a chronicle of mankind illustrated in simple, homely scenes, and in the 4 corner spandrels, the tragic events of the history of Israel, which all illustrate the bondage of man after the fall, fettered by the material world. And I'm not going to put too much emphasis on this, but you can see these are various homely scenes, figures representing the forefathers of Christ, and they nicely actually described, the names are painted on the tablets over there. You can see, for instance, on the Solomon, Boaz, Obed, then there is Jesse, David, and so forth. So they're very clearly represented. And then, as I said, in the corners, those corner spandrels, you have the history of, these are the bottom ones, the predated of also family members of Christ, but slightly larger panels. Asa and Ezechias, and here are of the 2 of the 4 corner pendentives, those big corner, slanted or actually curved panels in the corners. The structures form visual bridges between the walls and the ceiling, and the figures which are painted on them, as I said, are midway in size. This is the earthly sphere of ordinary human beings who struggle through life and who were unconsciously involved in Christ's incarnation. Michelangelo chose the ancestors of Christ as the subject of these images, thus portraying Jesus' physical lineage, his earthly lineage. Centrally placed above each window is a marble tablet with a decorative frame, and on each is painted the names of the male line by which Jesus, through his earthly father Joseph, is descended from Abraham according to the Gospel of Matthew. So all the descendants, the predecessors of Christ are represented there. The figures in them are physically divided by the name tablet, but they are also divided by a range of human emotions that turn them outward and in on themselves, and sometimes towards their partner with jealousy, suspicion, rage, and simply boredom. In them, Michelangelo has portrayed the anger and unhappiness of the human condition. The 4 triangular pendentives at the corners were much larger than the other 8 and are associated with the salvation of Israel by 4 great male and female heroes of the Jews: Moses, Esther, David, and Judith. These scenes represent David and Goliath, as you can see over there. David pinning Goliath down on the ground and in the process of removing his head. On the other side, Judith and Holofernes, where she has just beheaded Holofernes, and you see them leaving with his head on a tray. And Esther and Haman, you can see the crucifixion of Haman, which actually dates the crucifixion of Christ. And then Moses with a copper snake in the desert. You can see the snake in the background. If you look carefully, you'll see there, you can see the snake. And everybody that looks at the snake actually is saved from death by the snake bite, which also points to the story of Christ. Of the 14 lunettes, the 2 that were probably painted first, the families of Eleazar and Nathan, here they are, and of Jacob and Joseph on the other side, there in the middle, are the most detailed. They become progressively broader towards the altar end, one of the last being painted in only 2 days. These frescoes are masterly studies of human nature and clearly show Michelangelo's inventive depiction of the human form. In conclusion, I briefly want to say something of the recent restoration of the Sistine Chapel. And you remember I told you I'll show you some of the scenes of what they looked like originally and how they look now. If you look at the Jeremiah here, initially the very dark colors and the beautiful coloring of the clean one. And the same with Daniel down there. The frescoes were restored between June 1980 and December 1999, with preliminary tests taking place in 1979. Prior to restoration of all the paintings in the Sistine Chapel, the lunettes and the spandrels were the dirtiest. It was therefore obvious that the restoration was to have started with Michelangelo's lunettes, which was achieved in October 1984. The work then proceeded on the ceiling, completed in December 1989. and from there to the Last Judgment. The restoration was unveiled by Pope John Paul II on the 8th of April 1984. The restoration team comprised Gianluigi Colalucci, Maurizio Rossi, Pier Giorgio Bonetti, Bruno Barretti, and others. The final stage was the restoration of the wall frescoes by Botticelli, Ghirlandaio, Perugino, and others, which was finally unveiled on the 11th of December 1999. The restoration removed the filter of centuries of grime to reveal the original bright colors of Michelangelo's genius to us again anew. Michelangelo, forced to become a painter against his will, produced in the Sistine Chapel ceiling the greatest fresco of all time, or frescoes of all time, and in them achieved the most complete and perfect of his many great works of art. And I have included a number of the latest books on the Sistine Chapel ceiling, if you're interested in that. You can order them from Amazon, but they give you the latest views of what the thinking about the ceiling in our time is. Dixon Graham and Graham Dixon, H.W. Pfeiffer, and Mancinelli. But these are interesting books. I worked from these books to give you a lecture which brings you the most recent understanding of the Sistine Chapel ceiling. Thank you.
Here's one.
Okay.
Oh, sorry.
Was the church being used while he was painting?
No, it was closed. They only opened it for some special occasions. I know that the Pope slipped Raphael into the chapel to just have a look at what was going on there. And of course, immediately afterwards, Raphael went and removed the work that he was doing for the Pope in the Vatican chambers and repainted it. So he was very, very impressed with what he saw over there. But what they did do is, I somewhere on one of these sources I read that after the scaffolding was taken down for the first section, they did allow a number of clergy into the chapel. Yes, because you see, Pope Julius also stems from the Medici family.
So the figures, their faces, do they look like the Medici?
We don't know. We don't know. It's possible that he did use models from around him, but we don't know. There are instances where he did use even himself as a model, but we have no idea of who the people are that he painted.
I see they all have the same feet, so they might be migrating.
Yes. Yes.
The restoration must, well, as you said, took several years, and they must have erected scaffolding to get to the ceiling. Does that mean that the chapel was out of commission for all those years, or did they use a quick kind of a scaffolding?
You know, the very interesting thing is that they used exactly the same scaffolding that Michelangelo used when he designed it. They used the holes in the walls that Michelangelo had made to put their
beams.
So that the area in the chapel wasn't constricted by the scaffolding.
Oh,
so they could carry on with the. But you know, as the restoration also started
at the door,
at the entrance, at the door, and then moved to the altar. So it moved in stages. So they were allowed to use the area still.
Okay, so there was scaffolding on the side, on
Yes.
one side only, and then they moved
Then
it
they
over
moved
to the other side.
Yes, yes,
Interesting, yes.
yes. Yes,
Ek wil net 'n vraag vra na eintlik. Dis nou terug na die beelde
ja.
wat hy gemaak het. Ek wil die beeld van Moses. Hy het gesê wat hy so op die knie gekap
Ja,
het.
dis 'n storie wat Vasari vertel.
Ja, maar daar is stukke wild, dit lyk soos horings
Ja.
op sy kop.
Dit is 'n verkeerde vertaling van die Italiaans waar horings en ligstrale dieselfde woord is. Dit moes eintlik ligstrale gewees het wat uit sy kop uitstraal.
That's interessant.
En toe het hy horings daar gesit.
Ja. En dit is dit die een van in daai kerk
San Pietro in
Vincoli.
Ja, San Pietro in Vincoli in Rome.
Ja.
En weet jy, ek het voor daai beeld gestaan, as hulle sit die lig aan net vir 'n rukkie.
Ja.
En dan kan jy nou kyk en ek kan vir julle sê dit is 'n fenominale beeld. Dit lyk regtig asof hy enige oomblik gaan opstaan.
Ja.
Want jy weet, Michelangelo het 'n vreeslike studie gemaak van die menslike spier. En hy het agtergekom dat daar is sekere fases wat die spier ingaan as hy saamtrek en met ander woorde, hy het hom uitgebeeld op daai oomblik wanneer die spier so is dat hy wanneer jy opstaan en dit lyk regtig asof hy wil opstaan.
Ja, dit is fantastisch.
Dis fenomenaal.
Ons het hom ook gesien. En ons was in die Sistine kapel toe kom jy lê. Daar so, dat sulke bankies gehad. Dan kun jy lê en dan kun jy kyk na die ding. En dis nou, en jy loop. En ek weet nie hoe, jy sal baie vinnig moet kyk.
Ja, op die oomblik het hulle ook die tyd wat jy daar mag bly gesny. So jy kan net, ek weet dis soos 15 minute, jy mag nie langer as 15 minute
Ik kan het zien op 15 minuten.
So dis baie. Nog vrae? Thank you.